So what we're going to do now is to create some error handling middleware that we can add to our middleware inside our startup.cs class. Now, anything we put inside the configure method here, ordering is important. And let's just take a quick look at the documentation for ASP.NET Core middleware. And this little diagram here gives us the idea of what's going on here. We receive our request, it hits some middleware, there's some logic inside there, and then we hit the next method, and that passes it on to the next piece of middleware. And each piece of middleware is a request delegate that's called one after the other. And exception handling delegates should be called early in the pipeline so that they can catch exceptions that occur in later stages of the pipeline. And that's what we're going to do. So we're going to go back to VS Code, and inside our API project this time, and let's just organize things a little bit neater. Inside the API project, I'm just going to create a new folder and just call it middleware. And what we want to add in here is a new C# class, and we'll call it error handling middleware, and press return. Now we need a constructor in here, so let's create a new constructor, and this is going to take two parameters. First of all, we need to give it the request delegates that we were just referring to, and we'll call this next, and we'll also need to bring in ASP.NET Core HTTP, and as well as this, what we'll also bring in is the iLogger, so that we can log what's going on inside this particular middleware into our terminal window. So our iLogger needs to know the class it's logging against, so we'll pass in the error handling middleware and just call this logger. And we'll also need to bring in Microsoft extensions logging. And because we're injecting these inside here, what we'll also need to do is create the private fields. So we'll initialize a field from parameter for the request delegates, and we'll also do the same for the logger. And for some reason it's decided not to add the underscore here, so I'll just add this and remove this dot as well. So inside our middleware we need one method, and we need the public async task, and we need to call this invoke. And we need to pass this the HTTP context, and we'll just call this context. And we'll also need to bring in system.threading.tasks. So inside here we're going to have a try-catch block. Our goal here is to catch our exceptions and then do something with it. So in the try, all we want to do, if there's no exception, we'll just say await, and we'll say next, and pass the context. And this will move the request onto the next piece of middleware. And if there's an exception, we want to catch this, and we'll say catch exception ex. And we'll also need to bring in system. And what we'll do in here, we'll say await and handle exception async. And this will be a method that we create inside this particular class. And what we'll do is we'll pass it the context, we'll pass it our exception, and we'll also pass it the logger as well. And then we'll put our cursor inside this and use the quick fix to generate the method error handling middleware handle exception async. And then we can come down to this particular method and we can implement our logic inside here. Now I'm just going to create an object called errors, and I'm going to set this equal to null. And then what we want to do is take a look at our exception and see what type of exception it is, and if it's our REST exception, then we want to add our status code and our errors to the response, and if it's a normal exception, then we want to make sure this is sent back as a 500 internal server error. So what we'll do is we'll use a switch, and we'll base it on the exception we're passing in. And then in the case of it's a REST exception, and we'll call this RE, and we'll also need to bring in our application errors, and then we'll use the logger and say logger.log error, and we'll pass in the exception, and then we'll just put REST error in capitals so it's easily identifiable, and then we'll use our errors object and say errors equals re.errors, and then we'll use our context, and we can add something to our response here, so we can use the context.response and the status code, and we can set this to an integer, or we'll cast it to an integer, and we'll say re.code, and then we'll break from this particular case. So this deals with our REST exception, and we also need to deal with the normal exceptions because we're catching all of our exceptions now in this exception handling middleware. So in the case of a normal exception, we'll just say case exception and E, and then we'll say logger.log error, and in here we'll pass in the exception, and this time we'll say server error, and we'll say the errors object in this case equals string, and we'll check to see if this is null or white space for the error.message, and if it is null or white space we'll just say error, and if it's not null or white space we'll pass back the message. And then we need to add the response code to our response, so we'll say context.response.statuscode, and this one we're going to just return a 500 internal server error. So we'll cast this to an int, and we'll say http status code, and we'll say internal server error, and this is going to return a 500 for any normal exception that we get, and we'll just add a break to this as well. And then what we'll do, we'll just scroll down and we'll add a content type to our response so that it's serialized as application JSON. So we'll say context.response, and we'll say content type is equal to application/JSON. And then we'll check to see if we've got some errors. So we'll say if the errors is not equal to null, then what we want to do here is serialize our response as a JSON object. So we'll say var result is equal to, and we'll use the JSON serializer, which comes from a new feature in .NET Core 3.0, is to use system.text.json instead of the newtonsoft.json, which we would have needed to add in version 2.2 of the .NET framework. So what we'll do is we'll add JSON serializer, and let's see if we can bring in system.text.json to do this. And what we'll do is we'll say serialize, and we'll serialize this into a new object, and it's just going to contain our errors, and we'll add the semicolon. And then we need to write out the response as well. So what we'll do is we'll just say await context.response.write async, and then we'll pass in the result. So this handles both the types of exceptions we're going to have in our application, and what we'll take a look at next is how we can actually use this middleware.